Hey everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nissa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is... I'm standing on stuff. Today's video is a apple butter barbecue sauce, but I decided to try using my pressure canner as a steam canner. So I thought I'd bring you along for the process for my trial run, and it worked really well. I did a lot of research first. Rose Red Homestead on YouTube does a video about it, and I read some other stuff and found that it was worthwhile doing. So I wanted to give that a go while we made our big batch of apple butter barbecue. So I'm going to go through the process of making the sauce first, and then how I used the pressure canner as a steam canner to process it, and letting you know how it went and what I did. Thanks guys. Alright, so first process is just to mix all the ingredients together into a great big pot so that you can cook it down a little bit before you're canning it. Now I plan to use 2 pots and split the different batches because I thought it would cook down faster in a smaller pot and things like that, nice wide pots. So I'm using the apple butter that I canned June of last year. So in June of last year I managed to get a bin of apples, 180 kilos of apples for $95, and they were gorgeous pink lady apples. They were in season, they were beautiful. So I got that bin of apples and I went on a rampage of canning all sorts of apple products. We've still got a lot of stewed apples and apple pie filling and that sort of thing on the shelf, and we're going through the apple butter. I think there's only enough apple butter there to make one more big batch of this barbecue sauce, and that's probably what it'll be used for. I did discover that we don't use apple butter a whole lot of ways, but we do love the apple butter barbecue, and maybe if I can manage to score something like that again, I will just straight up make the barbecue sauce rather than canning the apple butter and then turning it into it, sort of double handling. Apple butter is really quick to make though. It doesn't need, like I figured out in the end how to do it in the pressure cooker. So I'd pressure cook the apple and then I'd puree it and then I'd can it. It was all very simple, whereas the apple butter barbecue requires a bit more handling to do, but still I feel like it's double handling to have done them both, so we'll see how we go. I originally looked at a whole bunch of different recipes for apple butter barbecue, or sauces that used apple butter in them. I looked at a whole bunch of different recipes, and the one that I ended up adapting from was Tasty Kitchen. So Tasty Kitchen has an apple butter barbecue recipe for canning, and that is what I used initially, though even the first time I made it I didn't use as much sugar because it just seemed excessive, but we've reduced it even more since that point because we just don't find we need it, and adjusted a few different things along the way. Also, obviously, I've increased it. So I'll put a link to the original recipe down below, and then I will put my alterations underneath that as well. The recipe is done in 8-cup portions of apple butter, and my 27s hold about 3 cups of apple butter. So each jar of apple butter here holds around about 3 cups of it, and that's what I'm working on there. So if the recipe is for 8 cups, in the bigger pot I did 24 cups, so a triple batch, and then in the smaller pot I added 16 cups to a total over both pots to be 5 times the original portioning. Sugar wise, I added 1 cup of sugar per batch. Now the recipe has 6 cups of sugar per batch, so that's 6 cups of sugar per 8 cups of apple butter, and there's no way that would be something that I could do. So initially I dropped it to 3, and it worked fine, still fairly sweet. So then I dropped it to 1. So I have even, I think, dropped it back to half a cup at times, and that was perfectly fine too. But I did 1 for this, and that'll be good for sitting on the shelf, is that 1 cup per batch. The recipe then adds tomato puree to it. So I use Passata because that's what I have on hand. I'd imagine that any sort of tomato pureed would work, any sort of non-chunky tomato product would work. So using Passata works really well, but you could puree up your diced tomatoes if you had home canned diced tomatoes or that sort of thing. I don't tend to can Passata or purees because I don't like to take the skin off my tomatoes, to be honest, but the Passata works really well for us. But the quantities of the Passata are somewhat variable because tomato doesn't require any acids. So you want to hit a minimum of your tomato to compensate for any other herbs and spices that you're going to be adding. But it doesn't really matter if you go over it. A bit the same with the apple butter. So long as you're hitting the minimums with the spices that you're adding, then that's going to be okay for your pH, but you don't want to go under the amount. So the recipe calls for around about 900 mils of the tomato puree per 8-cup batch of apple butter. So I have these jars of Passata, they're 780 mils I think they are, and I used 6 of these, so it worked out equivalent. You could, but some of these Passata jars are like 900 ml jars, which would work fine too, because as I said, if you're going over the tomato quantity, that's not such an issue whereas going under would be. So if you've got 900 ml Passata jars, and 6 of those is going to work fine too. But I used 6 of these Mutti brand because that happens to be what I've been buying lately and what I had on hand to be able to use for this recipe. Then you're going to add vinegar. So you need to add about 1.5 cups of vinegar per 8-cup batch of apple butter. I used mostly apple cider vinegar, but I did run short, so I used white vinegar for the end of that. Personal preference, what type of vinegar you're using. Obviously, you're supposed to use 5% vinegar because of the canning purposes of it, but most of our vinegar doesn't have percentages on it really, so I just end up being a little more generous with my vinegar so that I can compensate for that factor. So I end up using 7.5 cups of the vinegar. Now, one thing with Passata and the apple butter jars is that they don't come out of the jar cleanly, like you don't get all of the product out. So what I like to do is I use my vinegar to rinse out the bottles. It's a little bit messy because I have to, use a funnel to get the vinegar in the jars, and then you got to shake the jars, and then you got to pour them into pots, so to make sure that you're getting enough, make sure you're getting all the product out of the jars to go into the pot. And I made a mess. I spilt bits and pieces around the place while I was doing it, and I had to swap the funnel from jar to jar and all the rest of it. But I do think it's worthwhile to get those extra products out of the bottom. As I was adding the vinegar, I was quickly realizing that I'd overestimated the capacity of the pots and had to transfer it all. So I moved it to my big stainless steel Buffalo pressure canner or pressure cooker canner. It's a 35-litre pot and is stainless steel, so it's fine for high acid recipes. So I transferred everything into that pot so that I had more space. I didn't originally want to do it in this pot because it's a tall pot. It does have a tendency to burn on the bottom while you're trying to get the top to simmer, but you work with what you've got, don't you? So I continued to add the vinegar to the pot once I transferred it, realizing that I was going to need more room, and I kept on rinsing all those jars as I was doing it, and rinsing all the jars and putting it into the pot so that there was enough vinegar, but it was taking all the extras out of the jars as well into that pot. Once I got all the liquids in there, I started to add my seasonings. So my camera battery seems to have died halfway through this, which I didn't realize, but seasoning wise, you can have a look at the recipe. I do basically what's on the recipe, but I do garlic powder, some flaked salt, cinnamon, there's some smoked paprika, some black pepper. I don't put any cloves or cayenne or anything in it, which is on the original recipe. And I do add the liquid smoke though, which is really nice if I've got it. If I don't have it, I don't add it, and it doesn't make any difference. But when I do have it, I do add it, and it is lovely to have that smoky flavour. I do also add molasses because I just used raw sugar. The recipe calls for brown sugar. I couldn't be bothered making brown sugar when I was just going to dissolve it anyway, so I used raw sugar, and I just put a good glug of molasses in the pot as well to give it that brown sugar flavour. So that's what I did with that, and added all those spices, stirred it up really well, and then basically you're just going to simmer it on low until it reduces. So with this big pot, I want to make sure it's on a low temperature so it's not burning at the bottom. Come by and scrape the bottom very regularly, mix it all up and get it to a low simmer. When it's in a low simmer, it's going to reduce. I reduced mine by about 1/6, I reckon. It doesn't need to reduce heavily if you're using Passata and you've already reduced your apple butter, because there's not going to be a whole lot of water in either of those anyway. But it is a good idea to give it a good simmer and reduce it somewhat, just thicken it slightly, but it's to personal preference. You want to get it as thin or as thick as you want, realistically. If you don't cook some of that water out, when you can it, there will be separation, like when you can tomatoes. So you do want to cook it for at least, say, 20-30 minutes, just to cook that last bit of water that may have been introduced to the sauce out so that it doesn't separate in your jars. Because it's a sauce, In canned tomatoes and stuff, I don't really care because I'm normally pouring those canned tomatoes into another cooked item, so it's irrelevant. But with a sauce, you don't want to, though, mind you, when you buy sauce at a supermarket, if you don't shake it, there's that water sitting on the top of it anyway. So, you know, realistically, it doesn't matter, does it? So I cooked it off until it was a bit thicker. It had reduced somewhat and was a little bit thicker as I had wanted it to be. I decided to can it back into the 27s, which I'd emptied with the apple butter from. I did can it into passata jars last time, but it just didn't work because of that whole issue, like what I had with pouring the passata into the sauce in the first place. You can't get the bottom of the jar out. I could, if I was cooking something that I could water it down, like if I was making ribs or something, I could add a bit of vinegar and shake it and use that in the basting and things like that. But if I'm not doing anything like that, or if the kids are the last ones to use the jar, then there's just wastage. It just gets poured down the sink. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour it into the 27s, which are easy to use a spatula inside, and I'm going to transfer it into squeeze bottles each time we open a jar. So I'm just going to funnel it into a squeeze bottle and they can use that for eating with, but at least I can scrape those 27s empty in the meantime. So I ended up filling 18 jars with the sauce. But I also used the leftovers that were in the bottom of the pot to fill a squeeze bottle and a half for use for now. So 18 jars of just liquid straight off the top, and then I used a spatula to scrape the pot down and put in squeeze bottles for use over the next week or whatever. And did the normal process with the jars. So all the standard things. We're going to clean the rims with white vinegar, clean cloth white vinegar, clean them well to make sure there's no sauce on them to interfere with the seal. These are Fowler's Vicola jars, so they have the rubber rings. So I'm then going to put the rubber ring into the lip, and then I'm going to use a cloth to wipe the rubber ring down as well in case I had anything on my hands. I like to wash the lids in warm water, but I also like to clean the inside of them with white vinegar as well. We live somewhere dusty and dirty, and it's probably overkill, but I like to do it. So the lids are stainless steel reusable lids as well. The one-time use aspect of Fowler's Vicola jars are the rubber rings. So I clean the inside of the jars, put the lids on as well, and then put the clips on the jars. So my 27s don't fit in a steam canner. So it's annoying because the 27s are too tall to fit in a steam canner. And to water bath can them, it takes a really long time for the water to come up to boil for that size, that quantity for the size of the jars, and it uses a lot of water. So I did research, as I said, about using my pressure canner as a steam canner and decided to give that a go. So I put the rack in the bottom of the canner as normal and put all the jars in the canner. Then the process is to use a quart more water than you would use for pressure canning. So in my buffalo canner, I would normally use 4 quarts of water. In a Presto, it's 3 quarts. So I put 5 quarts of water in the bottom of the buffalo canner for this process. Now the water is warm because the jars are warm, and you want to keep your water in the canner the same temperature as the jars so that you don't have any thermal shock there. I put the lid on and turned on the heat. So what you're aiming for is a constant hard stream of steam, like what you do before you pressure can something. That 10 minutes steam stream, that's what you're aiming for, but in constant, and you want your little valve to pop up, your pressure valve to pop up. So once your canner is hard steaming and it has the pressure valve up, on mine it's that little red valve, then you can start your timer. So for me it's 25 minutes for these jars. And so once the steady stream of steam, hard steaming, the red valve is up, then I start my timer for 25 minutes. You want the valve to stay up and the steam to keep steaming full hard for the whole 25 minutes. So you keep an eye on that. You can hear it too if you walk away, of course. And then once you've had the 25 minutes, turn it off, and then you're going to wait for that little red valve or your pressure valve, whatever color it is on your, it's silver and the Presto. Once it drops down, then you can crack your lid. I like to leave my lid for 5 minutes just to let things equalize a little bit, and then after 5 minutes remove the jars to a board, and as per usual they need to rest on the board for 24 hours until you then check the seals and clean them and put them away on the shelf. So as you can see, there's still a decent amount of water left in the pot, so that's good. It means that that water wasn't excessive, but it was enough, that it had enough water in there to steam for the entire 25 minutes without running dry. If it runs dry, you're going to smell it, but you can damage your jars, you can damage your pot, and it stinks out the kitchen. So I have a second batch to do. So what I did was I topped up the water with an extra 3 quarts. So I guesstimated there was 2 or 3 quarts left, so I put, to be safe, I put an extra 3 quarts in. I used cold water because that water in the pot at the moment is really hot, and my jars have been sitting for the processing time, so they're not as hot anymore. So I put cold water in there to make that water warm rather than hot, and then put all the jars in the pot. So I was partially bringing the water level up to make sure there's enough water in there for the entire canning time, but also making sure that that water was more equivalent to the temperature of the jars. Then I put the second batch in, put the lid on, and repeated the process. So it hasn't been 24 hours yet, but the jars appear to have sealed as far as I can tell. They were bubbling when I pulled them out of the canner, as you can see when I pull them out, which is a good sign that they're going to seal. Everything looks good. There was no siphoning, no issues with headspace in the jars. Everything looks great. It steamed for the whole time, didn't run low on water. Everything looks really good. So I'll report back as to whether any of the jars fail. I did try reusing 2 seals. I'm not sure about reusing seals on my Fowler's jars, but apparently people have some success in it. I decided to reuse 2 rather than open a fresh packet of seals, and we'll see how they went. They were seals from the apple butter, so I used them on the barbecue sauce as well. We'll see. And yeah, so we got 18 jars of apple butter barbecue on the shelf. Realistically, that's probably only 3 or 4 months with 6 kids. Maybe, if I'm pushing it, if I'm limiting them a little bit. So it's not a huge amount. So hopefully we're coming into autumn now. Hopefully we'll get apples in season, and I'll be able to get a really good deal on apples again, and I'll make more. We didn't realize at the time when I was making it last time that we would like it as much as we do, and it's basically the only sauce we use. I don't make tomato sauces and stuff like that. I buy ketchup on our grocery ship every 6 to 8 weeks, 1 set of ketchup purely to have with hot dogs, and then they use it for a week because we've got it. But other than that, this apple butter barbecue is basically the only sauce that we use, and I really like it. I like that it's got minimal sugar in it for the quantities, and I can even half that sugar as well. We've tried it with half and it works out well. It's got a really nice tang, a smokiness, a sweetness. It's just lovely. So I highly recommend trying it if you haven't, and we will be making plenty more. But that was a really good run of using the pressure canner as a steam canner. I really enjoyed that, and it means that my camera battery just ran out on this video, and I just wanted to spend like 30 seconds more to finish this video off before I go inside. I don't want to run inside and grab a battery. So the pressure canner worked as a steam canner, which is wonderful because my Passata jars and the 27s do not fit in my steam canner, and that's one of the major issues with the steam canner that I have. It's because it's great, but it doesn't work for those jars, and I use those jars a lot for canning cordials and things like that. So I'm really glad to have found an alternate option which isn't just water bath canning, because boiling water bath canning that size jars is really awkward. It's messy, uses a lot of water, takes a lot of time. So hopefully everyone found that helpful, and I will see you on the next video. Bye guys.